Greetings and welcome to the latest episode of the Pandemic Podcast with me, Dan Aston Gregory. I'm delighted tonight to be joined by our special guest, Patrick Fagan, as we tackle this question, Operation Fear, how are we being played? As we can see all around us, Operation Fear has been ramped right up again on the back of the latest Indian variant, which we covered in yesterday's podcast, with dire warnings. Or are they threats that our freedoms may not be restored after all? But how does this actually work? How do these messaging actually affect us as we see this lure of freedom and then this gradual retraction? My guest today is Patrick Fagan, a behavioral scientist who's got 12 years plus experience turning minds into money. He's worked for big name brands and on political campaigns worldwide. He's the former lead psychologist at the now defunct Cambridge Analytica, which infamously attempted to use the psychological profiles of roughly 90 million Facebook users to influence their political decisions. Though I will note Patrick was not involved in any of those campaigns. He is the author of Hooked, the Pearson published book on the psychology of effective messaging. So drawing on this eclectic breadth of experience and behavioral science and psychology, we'll be taking a look at how these behavioral tactics can be used to ramp up fear in order to increase control, and the wider impact of lockdowns, masks, social distancing, testing, and the other measures that we've been subjected to now for more than a year. So we're here now for what promises to be a fascinating exploration of these key subjects around how behavioral science has played a part in the management of this pandemic. So please do share this episode as we cover this live. Welcome to the show, Patrick. Looking forward to a fantastic conversation this evening.
Hi, great. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
So we mentioned offline the elephant in the room. Many people would have heard of Cambridge Analytica. You were there for a brief period of time. Tell us a little bit about what your role was there.
I was the lead psychologist, a contractor at Cambridge Analytica for 8 months until the sticky end. I mostly worked in the commercial department, so bottled water and insurance, more than anything else. But my role there was to understand how to measure psychological traits in people, personality traits and so on, motivations, etc., and then crucially how to use that to message different groups in the right way that would be most persuasive. So for example, if you have a group that's very extroverted and outgoing, then you would present bottled water as a way to be cool, and you do it in a message that's very vibrant and social and colorful, and you'd use a social proof nudge by saying everyone else is doing this.
Very interesting. I mean, one of my favorite books around human behavior is Influence by Robert Cialdini, where he talks about some of these principles, these behavioral principles. Now, it's a fascinating subject. Before we dive into the situation around the pandemic and how these behavioral tactics are being used, what got you into this field? What drew you into the field of behavioral science?
Yeah, I'm probably not helping my ethical credentials here, but when I was about 17 or 18, I was very much into dating. And there was a whole kind of field, it was called pickup artists at the time. I'm not proud of it, but I was into that. And that really got me into psychology because they talk a lot about body language, evolutionary psychology, personality traits, subconscious motivations. So it was a really interesting topic. And I was also quite interested in advertising in terms of how messages can communicate things that you're not consciously aware of. And then Darren Brown was quite popular at that time as well. So I think these things came together to kind of interest me.
Interesting. I mean, I followed the business advice of the likes of Eben Pagan, and he was David D'Angelo back in the
Double your dating.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So fascinating to hear that. So let's draw that, bring it right up to speed in terms of this day and age. The use of behavioral tactics and psychological manipulation to increase fear and control, to manipulate the public. This is a big topic. How have some of these tactics, or have they been used? I mean, for someone who has at least a relative understanding of some of these things, I can see it from my point of view quite clearly. But how have these been things? Have they been used? What sort of tactics have we witnessed throughout this pandemic?
I think there's two levels. There's the kind of explicit, admitted nudges that have been used, and ones that are quite obvious and that you can infer. So there have been documents released, famously, for example, saying you need to ramp up the level of perceived threats. There's been a document that I think the NHS uses where it talks about using norms, social norms, and making things easy in communications and all of these kind of things. So on the one level, there are these nudges, particularly fear messaging, which we can talk about more in depth, which have been used quite overtly. So for example, recently there have been adverts saying, join the millions of others who have been vaccinated already. And that's a very classic social proof nudge. If everyone else is doing it, you should too, and you don't want to be left out. Then there's the other level, which is the more covert kind of nudges and tactics, which I can't obviously have no proof that they've been used. But to me, it seems obvious. And there's so many. I mean, for example, what's a fun one? Matt Hancock using what's known as celebrity contagion, kind of, or emotional contagion, by wearing the NHS badge constantly. He's kind of taking all of that emotional goodwill that the NHS has and trying to bring that over to himself in his messaging. And you'll frequently see on adverts, for example, they have the NHS logo, even though it has sometimes nothing to do with the NHS, because they're borrowing that goodwill, that authority heuristic, that cue that you can trust it. There's also, I think the main one though really is, there's a lot of names for it: the foot in the door, gradualism, salami slicing. I think most people know it as boiling the frog. So this urban legend that if you put a frog in a hot pot of water, it will immediately leap out. But if you put it in cold water and turn the heat up, then it will acclimatize to it and it will just stay in there and get boiled alive. And so they bring in changes very slowly and gradually, so that people get used to them over the time, rather than just introducing some massive thing that people would revolt against. So it seems to me they have a clear pattern of deny, consider, mandate. So with the vaccine passports, for example, a few months ago, they were completely denying it, saying they would never have vaccine passports. It's unthinkable. What that does is it introduces the idea to the public imagination so that actually it becomes more palatable. So even though they say they're not doing it, well, now you're thinking about it and talking about it, it goes from the realm of unthinkable to thinkable. And now we're at the recommend stage. And then eventually it will be, well, I don't know for sure, but it will probably be mandated. Or we're seeing that they say they'll introduce it just for concerts and sports events, but obviously that's how it starts, and it will gradually move into other things. So I think that's the big one. Is in the nudge unit they call it radical incrementalism, just like compound interest. It's very small changes can accumulate over time without people noticing. But there's many others as well.
I mean, that's fascinating. Just on the background of nudging, could you kind of give it a layman's terms what that means?
So nudging is the idea of, rather than forcing people to do something, you just give them a gentle nudge. So for example, rather than making cigarettes illegal, you can just have a nudge of putting disgusting images on them. So you're still allowing people to smoke, but you recognize it's not in their best interests. So you're just trying to kind of use psychology to nudge them away from it. Now, interestingly, nudging is itself a nudge. The term is a nudge. So there's a nudge called reframing, because we're more sensitive to losses than we are to gains. So if you reframe something as a gain, people are more open to it. So if you have beef that's on sale, and this came from a study, people are more likely to buy it if you say it's 80% lean on the packaging than if you say it's 20% fat, even though those mean the same things. So nudging is just another word for subconscious manipulation, but nudging sounds a lot nicer, right? So that's it. So, and then what it is in practice is understanding that people are what's known as cognitive misers. They have very limited attention spans for making decisions. It's estimated we make around 200 food decisions each day alone, some more than others, speaking for myself. So if we had to think through those consciously, we just couldn't operate. So we have to rely on subconscious heuristics, rules of thumb. Like, for example, if a restaurant is popular, it must be good. That's something that's an inference we make without thinking about it. And so nudges are just a way of exploiting these subconscious rules of thumb that exist.
Wow, there's lots of things that I want to draw upon. You've got popularity, social proof, but before we go into some of those, talk about fear messaging. Can you give some examples of how the fear messaging has been used and what the implications are for the recipient?
So fear messaging, I suppose the biggest example is "Look Them in the Eyes," that ad campaign, which showed terrified and I guess victimized people, very stark messaging, very stark aesthetics, and using a nudge called the watching eyes effect, where if we feel that we're being watched, we're more likely to act in a compliant way, more likely to donate to charity, wash your hands, things like that. So making people feel scared, feel like they're being watched. But I mean, really, you could argue all of it's been non-stop here, really, in the news, the press releases, the ad campaigns. I made the sensible decision to unplug from TV and radio as much as possible. But I hear that the tone of the advertising has just got crazy, really, in terms of fear and guilt as well, I think.
Yeah, so I think, it's fascinating. I talked to quite a few people who come from the world of marketing, and it's interesting that not all of them, there's some that just don't get it still, but I find that those who have worked in marketing or sales or anything that they've used, or particularly advertising, where they're used to looking at principles of how to use concepts like nudging and these different messaging techniques in order to quote unquote manipulate behavior, which effectively, if you strip it back, that is essentially what its intent is.
Yeah. We
can discuss the ethics around that in a moment, but when someone has that overt awareness of they're likely to be able to see this, and it's interesting to say you switched off because you don't want to succumb to it, because you're right, it's been a bombardment. And really interesting to hear you say about the kind of radical incrementalism. We've seen that, I think, then spontaneously with just spikes of pure alarmism and sensationalism. What are the impacts of interjecting with some of those sensationalistic or alarmist messaging?
I feel, again, this is, I guess, more of a gut feel and based on kind of older research, but it seems like, if a wave's crashing against a rock, it has to come in waves in order to erode the rock. And in the same way, I think potentially you need these periods of alarm, relax, because then it's more, I think there's a name for it, fractionism, maybe, from hypnosis. Well, I'm not an expert on that, but yeah, doing it in waves, I think, is more effective. The first thing for me, though, that really got to me was the way they were presenting statistics and exploiting something called the ratio bias. Because really, the first thing that raised a flag for me was why are they showing the absolute number of cases and not showing it as a ratio of the number of tests? Because you do more tests, you do more cases. I mean, that's GCSE maths, isn't it, per capita? Yes. And it seemed like it was a very deliberate way of stoking fear.
Absolutely. I mean, are there any other flags or particular examples that have stood out to you throughout this campaign that are textbook behavioral science?
Yeah, I mean, lots of it. I mean, obviously authority cues. So relying on scientists, people in lab coats. If they've said it, it must be right. Using conformity, obviously, is a big one. Not wanting to be ostracized. There are two things, and I don't know for certain. I'm not saying they've been used, but they certainly have happened. One is the behavioral immune system, where when you're exposed to ideas of disease and disgust, you react in a behavioral way, so a predictable behavioral way. And the other is terror management theory, which is where you're made to think of death and mortality. You also behave in a predictable way, which is quite similar. And both of these together kind of make people more insular, more intolerant, more obviously scared, more looking to cling to authority and existing structures. So yeah, I don't know that I can't say they've definitely been exploited, but that's something I've really seen happen and play out over the last year.
I mean, I'm familiar with the Milgram experiments, which, you know, for me is a classic case where you witness the impact of a perceived authority. I think, you know, what I've observed in tackling some of these issues, you know, a lot of them are contentious issues, but there are some people who just seem to have open minds and are willing to consider an alternative perspective. But there are many people who can't see beyond what they're being told by the media or the press or the government, and they just can't get their head around that there may be a problem. There may be there may be a different way to see it. You know, this blatant trust of authority. What is it that leads to that behavior? I mean, what creates those conditions?
There's a few things. So there's a good book called Willful Blindness, and a psychologist I used to work with used to say the mind only lets you see what it thinks you can handle, or something like that. But the idea being that some of the implications may be so terrifying and potentially psychologically traumatic that people just can't face up to them. It's the ostrich effect. They kind of put their head in the sand, and they can't handle the cognitive dissonance. And similarly, there's systems justification theory, where people who have benefited from the system, you know, the UK, the government and state and so on, that they can't countenance that it would ever do anything wrong or do anything harmful. And then again, there's just authority in general. You're just more likely to follow authority figures and believe what they're saying because they're in positions of authority. And this is a bias that's kept us alive and society functioning since time immemorial. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can. It's a bit like a moth flying into a candle. You know, moths following lights have kept them alive for a long time, but it just sometimes it can go a bit askew in the modern world. Then, of course, there's conformity. Some people are just scared to make alternative opinions known. And, of course, some people, perhaps rightly so, are very scared of the virus. And so that fear is kind of keeping them from doing anything unorthodox. But yeah, I think it is mostly fear of ostracization, fear of the virus, or fear of the potential implications, and challenging your entire worldview is a very traumatic, scary thing.
Yeah, I think that there's the other two pieces I like to draw: the worldview piece there, and also the ostracization. I think the worldview piece, it feels like, you know, if for someone, if they discover that what they're seeing is not accurate, it may shatter their entire worldview, which leads them to then question other parts of their version of reality, or even their own self-identity. And I would suggest a lot of people are afraid of facing that possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I've been Googling, how do I know the Earth's not flat? Things like that recently, because it's like, I'm not saying that the Earth is flat, but my point is that, once you pull on that thread and you start questioning one thing, it's very scary and chaotic and uncertain because you don't know what to trust. And you're seeing this kind of collapse of trust, collapse in institutions. Like the Oscars viewership fell by 58% this year. I imagine you're going to see a similar thing with universities and trust in scientists and so on. So it's a scary, kind of confusing result of asking this kind of questions.
Well, interesting. On the flip side, what I've observed from many of the conversations I've had with people that have either featured on this podcast or through audiences or through events, protest events that I've been to, it seems that people who have been through some level of personal trauma, where it's forced them to confront their own personal reality, or they've had to confront their own personal beliefs, they seem to be more open-minded and willing to look at how their worldview could be different. They seem more open-minded to looking at their pre-existing beliefs around these worldview issues. What do you think? What do you think of that concept?
I absolutely agree, and that's a pattern that I recognized myself. I'm not sure what the answer is. I think maybe people who've been through trauma, maybe number one, I guess it depends on the trauma, but they can kind of better recognize patterns of abuse, which I dare say maybe you see from the state in terms of, you know, keeping you isolated and dare I say gaslighting you with confusing, contradictory information, etc., etc. So maybe they're better able to recognize what may be happening. And then but then I think, for example, there's people who have been to who've had maybe substance abuse problems as well, similar, and that's not necessarily the same kind of trauma. So maybe it's people who have more on the outside, or have at some point in their life been more on the fringes, are more open to asking these kind of questions. And I did do a psychology survey. I got about 3,500 responses where I asked personality traits, and I found one of the main personality traits that predicted compliance was need to belong. So being worried about being ostracized, for example. Someone who's been through trauma has kind of they've done that. They've been through that, and they came out the other side, and they've lived with it. So they're probably less scared by it, maybe.
Yes. I mean, I grew up as a heavy metal fan and got ostracized for my choice in music. So, I'm kind of used to that. Red hair, all this sort of stuff. So perhaps
one of the other traits was also disagreeableness. So agreeable people are more likely to comply, whereas more disagreeable people, I include myself in that, people who like heavy metal, horror films, graphic novels, etc., they're less likely to comply. And that's been painted in the media as like being, I don't know, psychopathic, unempathetic. I don't think that's true at all, at least in my anecdotal experience. I think it's just more to do with cooperativeness and submission, really, non-confrontational nature.
Yeah, so and that pattern also I found, I've spent the last decade plus working with entrepreneurs. I find it's a trait that I find within creatives, naturally curious, great pattern recognition, willing to look outside the box, question, the title of this podcast is Question Everything, more questioning of authority, more questioning the status quo. That's why we get these disruptors and innovators. I think it all comes from the same mindset. And it's unsurprising to me that I find a lot of entrepreneurs part of this audience.
Yeah.
Often very successful people that, not the classic conspiracy types that are painted in the media for questioning these things, very balanced, intelligent minds, but they have that open-mindedness.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that as well in terms of entrepreneurialism. So people who are less going along with this seem to be less likely to have, regular kind of office jobs. It could work the other way though, because if you have an office job, you're kind of forced into complying in order to keep your job. And therefore, often actually attitudes follow behaviors rather than the other way around. So once you, whatever it is, to comply, wear a mask, etc., you'll start to post-rationalize that, I'm wearing a mask, therefore it must work, because I wouldn't do something that doesn't work.
Right.
But then on your other point, interestingly, I did find a small negative correlation between or a small positive correlation between compliance and cognitive reflection. So that's getting 3 brain teaser questions right. But so basically, people who don't comply are more likely to follow their gut. And my interpretation of that is people who are kind of more following the mainstream narrative maybe are better able to post-rationalize things. So basically, Orwell said there are some things so absurd only an intellectual could believe them.
Right. Yes. I can see that as well. Now, this notion of Operation Fear, a lot of people have been in fear for various different reasons, whether that's fear of the virus, fear of losing their freedoms, fear of something bigger, whatever the fear may be. I think a lot of people have been subjected to that over a period of time. I can't imagine what impact that's had on our kind of collective nervous system and our, cortisol levels. I mean, even studying briefly in my own past in terms of crisis management and crisis leadership through some of the work I've done previously, witnessing how people's decision-making abilities under fear are radically altered. What are some of these? I mean, that's even after a short period of fear. So to sustained fear, goodness me, I don't know the long-term implications, but what are some of the unintended consequences or spillover effects that come from this level of fear?
Well, stress is bad for your health, very bad. The more stress, like neurotic people live less long, for example. So fear, I think the impact will be delayed. I'm not sure if there's any big evidence yet in terms of suicide rate. I know there's been little bits and pieces here, like a huge increase in calls to helplines and things, but I expect, sadly, we will see that effect. But yeah, I mean, it's not just the obvious things like that, but it depresses your immune system, fear, and it's just really not good for you, for your mental health or your physical health.
Okay, and in terms of if the government are using it overtly or covertly, are there unintended consequences in terms of human behaviour that could adversely or affect the intended outcomes of the policies?
So sorry, one thing I do want to add is that it's not just the messaging, I think, that's driving fear. So there was a study in Israel where they found that under lockdown, the amygdala, which is in basic terms fear processing part of the brain, increased by 15%. So it grew significantly under lockdown. So being confined and socially isolated makes you more stressed, more anxious. It's going to raise fear levels. Also, the face masks, I think there's pretty good evidence they do increase CO2 levels, even if it's very, very minutely. And the amygdala, again, has specific CO2 receptors in it, which detects CO2, and that drives fear as well. So it's not just the news and the messaging, but also the social isolation, the confinement, maybe the face mask, also uncertainty and not working, not having purpose in day-to-day life. All of these things, I think, are going to be making people more stressed and scared. And then I think, I have no evidence, of course, that it's being done deliberately, but that helps in terms of when people are scared, they, as I say, cling to authority and basically do what they're told. Fear is something that kind of breaks down conscious critical resistance, makes you very emotional, makes you much more likely to act on these heuristics like authority, social proof, conformity. And fear is also a very, very strong motivator of behavior. It's, according to a brain imaging meta-analysis, it's probably the strongest emotion. So it's very powerful. Emotion is like the steam in the engine that drives behavior. It motivates people to do something, and fear is probably the best one for that. So I think in a way, it's good for the government because it gets people to do what they're told to do.
Well, yeah, it drives compliance and ultimately gives power into the hands of the ruling class, really, in the state. It gives state control. Now, you could argue in the face of an existential threat, if this was that, which I don't believe it is, but there's certainly some level of threat. You could argue that some of these things are reasonable, but for sustained periods of time, I find that perhaps what we've seen is unethical. And where does the line get drawn? We talk about nudging. I've heard of sludging as a kind of the unethical nudge. Where do ethics come into this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question I've been grappling with because I work in sludging. I help companies sell stuff. It's not the most ethical thing in the world, but I wouldn't say it's particularly unethical. We've been selling stuff forever. There's always been marketing.
Yeah, forgive me if I may have used the term incorrectly, so forgive me if.
No, you're right. Sludging is using nudging to sell stuff, basically, for commercial reasons. But I actually am wondering if that's more ethical than nudging, which is what the government and third party uses, because with Coca-Cola, if they want to nudge people into buying stuff, there's kind of a transparency in that selfishness. It's using behavioral science to get people to do what you want them to do versus using behavioral science to get people to do what you think they should do. I think that second one is far more insidious because there's so much creep and it kind of never ends. And also you can't opt out of nudging, really. I mean, if I don't like Coca-Cola, if I think they're being creepy, I can stop buying it, but I can't opt out of the government, particularly about global government. So I think the ethics, in terms of doing it ethically, it's don't assume that you know what's best for other people, because everyone's influenced by irrationality, including the nudgers, the behavioral scientists in SPY-B. they're just as rational as everyone else. It's quite actually arrogant of them to think that they know what's best and they know the best behaviors that people should be taking. It used to be, when I first started in behavioral science, there was a very popular theory called the wisdom of the crowds, where, for example, in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the crowd usually gets the answer right when you do ask the audience, because when you take people together collectively, they do the right thing, and the systems, these complex systems, work. But it seems like that's been kind of thrown aside, and there's this tiny group of people, tiny group of behavioral scientists who think that they know what's best for everyone, and they're going to influence everyone else's behavior, and they're assuming that they're not irrational. I think that's really where the ethics lies, is not assuming you know what's best for everyone, but also you need to give people the ability to opt out.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's lots of situations where we haven't had that ability to opt out. Lockdowns, you have mandated masks, etc., social distancing. Let's talk about masks briefly, and some of these other concepts. How can behavioral science drive compliance to these tools, these concepts? And then I'd be interested to get your reflections on, the overall psychology around mask wearing.
So by obviously you need to motivate people to do something in the first place. So there's the fear aspect, but there's also social norms. You don't want to stand out, you don't want to be odd, but also if everyone else is doing something, you will just do it naturally. So there's a social proof and conformity element to it. With something like masks, it's shown as a preventative or a protective behavior. So you need to show that it works. So that's a really important thing. You need to show that it's something you can do easily, which I think masks, very easy to put them on and to buy them and so on. But you need to show that it works as well. So I think where we've seen a lot of this efficacy messaging coming in has been for that. So easy, social, make it attractive. So I guess, again, you don't want to be the odd one out, but also there have been campaigns to make it look cool and trendy. Probably influencers, almost certainly, I don't have any proof, but almost certainly influencers have been commissioned to wear masks and promote masks, make them fashionable. I think those are the main tactics, I would imagine.
Okay, and then, but what about the psychology of wearing a mask? How does that change people's perception of the situation?
So there is some research, and it's not the best research, but it found that wearing a mask influences your behavior. It makes you more disinhibited or less inhibited. So, for example, in the study, it was at a university, students were more likely to hold up a sign saying, "I love pornography" or something if they're wearing a mask.
Right.
All students probably do that now, probably get kicked out if you don't. So it makes you less inhibited. And as I said earlier, potentially it increases CO2 slightly, which we've seen some evidence that may make people tired and irritable, less able to concentrate, and also potentially feeling more anxious. And in terms of the inhibition thing, you do see that in other contexts. So, for example, when people are online, they're a bit less polite, a bit more likely to troll because their identity is not as connected to what they're saying. So I think potentially the masks will just take that offline. And we've seen some small bits of evidence here and there that people are maybe more aggressive, a bit more harassment of women on public transport and so on once masks have been introduced.
Yeah. Okay. There's a couple of things I'll touch on here as well. Last summer when they were mandated, the point where really we're at probably the lowest point of the lowest level of infections, and the severe first wave had passed, but all of a sudden this mandate, despite not being used during the actual peak of the pandemic, these summer months, all of a sudden, you walk out and there's people walls of masks. And I said at the time, you wouldn't have known there was in the data, you would not have known there was a pandemic, but this visual cue is a constant reminder. Could you comment on the impact of those visual cues?
Yeah, exactly. So, the virus is an invisible enemy, right? You can't see it. You can only see it through data, which is very abstract, and we don't really deal with data very well. So what the masks do is it make it concrete and real and visual. So if you can see everyone's wearing masks everywhere, it reminds you of the virus, it makes you think about the pandemic, and it just, it brings it out into the physical world for you to see. It makes it a concrete, real thing.
And are you able to comment on some of the impacts of lockdowns, masks, etc., on our mental well-being in particular? What are some observations you've made in those areas?
I mean, I think the evidence is unequivocal, really, that it's had a very negative impact on well-being. I mean, and this was all very predictable. At the start, even before the lockdown in the UK, I spent about an hour doing a literature review where I read previous academic research, and looking at kind of research with bases in the Antarctic and simulated space flights and prisoners and what's it called what they do to prisoners? They put them in isolation, solitary confinement.
Yep.
So there's all this research out there showing that it obviously makes people stressed and all these negative emotions. It can produce insomnia, difficulty sleeping, vivid dreams, difficulty concentrating and forming sentences. And all of these things have, lo and behold, kind of played out as a result of lockdown. It's not good for your mental health, basically.
And then from a behavioral science point of view, or a messaging point, if someone is if someone is in that state, that physical, emotional, physiological state, does that make them more receptive to messaging? What's the impact on the messaging side when they're in those conditions?
Yeah, so there's some great books, kind of older books on brainwashing and totalitarianism and cults and things, which say that if you can induce kind of confusion and fear and very strong emotions, interestingly also, it doesn't really matter if it's fear or anger, the end result is to kind of break people down and make them more open and more susceptible to new messaging, to kind of build back better of new thoughts, new habits, new behaviors, and so on. So, for example, in some religious cults, they get people to handle snakes because the intense kind of fear breaks down their defenses. So, as I said, those are quite some old books. More recent, more sciencey kind of research would say, for example, the disrupted and reframe effect is where you basically bamboozle some people with something. So they're kind of confused, and then you slip in your persuasive message straight after the bamboozlement, and that's more effective. So there is more recent scientific support for that as well.
Well, now I want to examine some other components here that is part of this. The deterioration of social cohesion. We've seen kind of divide and conquer type of tactics. What are your perspectives around the deterioration of social cohesion, and where do you think society is likely to be heading? And what are some of the factors that have been emerging? I know there's about 3 questions in one, but what are your perspectives around this piece around the deterioration of social cohesion and some of the factors within that's playing out here?
As I said, there's a behavioral immune system, which can kind of be summarized as, if you make people focus on purity, they'll become Puritans. So people are becoming less tolerant and more kind of insular and more in-group bias and things. And also bearing in mind, we've all been kind of locked in our homes and unable to talk to people and have contact with people. And also there haven't been catharsis, so we don't get to go out and get drunk at the weekend or go and yell at football matches. All of this stuff of venting your emotions, which we've been denied. Bring all these things together, I think it's quite a dangerous situation, a bit of a tinderbox. And I think you're seeing that, really. You saw it, especially in the US, played out last year during the summer. It was an election year, so it's slightly different, but I think you're seeing it build up again as the weather comes up in the UK with lots of different protests and a kind of group conflicts between different groups and things. But there is a theory that this kind of society goes through a cycle every kind of 80 to 100 years. It's called a cyclone. And so it kind of goes spring, winter, spring, summer, autumn, winter. And so we may just be going into winter like we did 80 to 100 years ago in Europe. It may just be happening again. So I think you're asking, where's it going? This is kind of my roundabout way of saying I'm not too optimistic.
Oh dear. Okay. Now, some of the cultural factors, the social cultural factors, we've got a behavioral scientist on our team, Sinead, who talks about there's a book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and
Yeah.
within that, this piece around the woke ideology, which has been building somewhat gradually, but I would say accelerating within the last few years. Is there any implications of that ideology in terms of what we're experiencing now?
So I think it's connected to there were certain conditions that had to exist in society for this response to have happened and for the public to have accepted what's happened. And so there's a researcher called Jean Twenge, and she's monitored certain personality traits over decades. And she's found that narcissism has increased since about the 90s significantly, and external locus of control has increased quite a lot since the 60s.
Wow.
So what that means is it's essentially a victim mentality, that people more increasingly feel that they're special, but also that they don't really have any control over their lives. That's potentially because of consumerism, where you're more of a consumer than a producer, and industrialization, where you're just a cog in a machine. And I think social media and the internet is a whole other kettle of fish. There's a case study on it was about a woman who developed psychosis from Twitter, and she started to see meaning in just kind of random jumbles of letters and symbols in Twitter. And I think although QAnon had some kind of valid points, but that side of things, being able to predict the future from random symbols, I think aligns quite nicely with that psychosis case study. So the internet, social media technology just makes us more impulsive, more kind of less in control of the lives, and more being manipulated. And all of this, it kind of feeds into this idea of wanting to be safe all the time, not feeling like we're potentially threatened. I mean, even I, as someone who's quite like lucky in terms of my life, I can go on Twitter and I can feel victimized within a minute by reading certain tweets. I think there's so much information out there that we're not supposed to see, and we have what's known as negativity bias, where we pay more attention to negative things. It's just it's building this kind of hysterical, more emotional, more impulsive state of mind, and that set the groundwork in which this could happen.
Interesting to hear about this rise in narcissism since the 90s. I mean, corresponding almost directly with the increase of the development of social media, digital internet, social tools, prevalence of mobile phones, etc. I think it's been long cited that social media has driven this narcissistic behavior. It's very much driven this kind of look at me, people creating false perceptions of the reality within their own lifestyle, showing their best side. So it's interesting to see how some of those factors may have created the conditions for this situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, sorry.
Yeah, there's research as well showing that, for example, the more you use the search function on your smartphone, the worse you score on cognitive tests.
Wow.
And there's all sorts of this kind of research. There's a great book on it called The Shallows, which I'd recommend. And there's also a book called Distracting Ourselves to Death, which was written in the 80s, but basically the same kind of thing. It says in the book how at the first Lincoln-Douglas presidential debate, the debate went on for 7 hours. So people had a lot more capacity for more kind of reflective, conscious thought, I think, back then. Whereas now, research has shown that reading comprehension is declining over time. So we're just, as I say, shallower thinking, more emotional, and that just, it makes people more scared, more liable to be nudged, because they need that kind of structure from outside.
Interesting. Now, the other part, I suggest is somewhat linked to this woke, increasing of this woke culture. Is one hand is the cancel culture. We've seen this driven into overdrive since the pandemic emerged. Anyone that's putting their head above the parapet to share a contrary view is censored, shut down, deplatformed. What are some of the issues you perceive in that area?
Yeah, it's absolutely happening. Again, I think because of this behavioral immune system where people become less tolerant, probably explains it. People want purity. They want everyone marching to the same drumbeat. Obviously, that's, historically that hasn't tended to end very well. That desire for everyone to come together and wear the same uniforms and for everything to be nice and clean. But also, I mean, oddballs and people on the fringes and outsiders are actually really, really important for society. So it's like evolution needs random mutation to happen. In the same way, society needs people who challenge the orthodox and say different things in order to make these evolutionary bounds in terms of society. So Socrates obviously is a great example of that. He called himself a gadfly. He said it was his duty to be a fly that bit the horse that was the public and just annoy them and stir them into action. And so those people are important, but obviously Socrates was killed by the mob. So.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of warning signs here about what could come from this. You said the future could be bleak. I think when we get the situation where we've got cancel culture, we've got suppression of science, we've got politicization of science. I mean, there was a fantastic, I don't know if you've seen this one, a fantastic paper from one of the US universities and one from New Zealand, which was talking about the moralization of lockdown policies and how this sense of virtue has been attached to the idea of lockdowns, and that and it's in the messaging. Think about the primary messaging from the UK. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. It's I forget. I like yourself been tuning out from the media, so I've probably got the statement wrong. But for a lot of people, that's been etched on their minds. But it plays into that sense of virtue that you were doing something good. We're looking after one another, we're protecting granny. But for me, I see that it creates a barrier to actually being able to examine the fundamental assumptions that underpin those policies. It creates a barrier to actually look at the cost benefit analysis of those policies. It creates a barrier to actually even go as far as looking if the empirical evidence supports those policies, purely because of that moral engagement. And it feels like it's become, lockdowns themselves have become ideological, not beyond moralized. How does something like that happen at scale?
Yeah, I think that's related to the kind of woke council culture type stuff as well. So there's the politics of ressentiment, which is French for resentment, politics of envy. Basically, people who feel kind of marginalized and not included or victimized or whatever by society want to flip it on its head, obviously, and get what they feel that they're owed. And often because they feel disenfranchised and so on, one of the ways in which they can feel superior is through moral superiority. And obviously you see that used an awful lot online, just to shut down debate and to say, you're not better than me, or I'm better than you. I think AOC said something about people caring too much if something is factually true and not enough if it's morally true. So yeah, I think it's used as kind of a cudgel, as a political weapon, a way to get power, basically.
I mean, in the studies, it referenced how this moralization had literally become. It put blinkers on, it get blind eyes. It meant that people were overlooking the fact that there's, for example, in the UK, over 300,000 people with missed cancer diagnoses, and the implication. I think that maybe I need to check my statistics on that, but you get the point. We've got these record waiting lists for the NHS now, the longest waiting list in history. We've got obviously greatest national debt in the UK's history. We've got mental health epidemic, lost jobs, lost livelihoods, let alone all the soft things like simply all the things that bring us joy, like human connection and family life. But it talked about how this moralization prevented people from even looking at those things in the context of policy. I mean, I find that outrageous, but you can just see it happening.
Yeah, it doesn't make any rational sense, really.
Well, it doesn't. So my final set of questions then is around how can some of these behavioral science principles help us to reduce the fear and perhaps go as far as deprogramming. I feel like I mean I truthfully, before we even had this interview booked, I'd opened up about 20 to 30 different articles on cult deprogramming to try and understand how, because I feel like we're in collective hypnosis. It feels like at some point, once the hysteria is over, the bubble will burst and we all get back to what I call conscious awareness, and we'll see the issues for what they are. And I can already see it in like 5 to 10 years time, these talking heads saying it's unbelievable what we did during the coronavirus, all the things that myself and others on this show have talked about, all these key issues will suddenly be we'll get back to that place like at the end of Professor Zombardo's work, where he did the Stanford prison experiment, where once he took them out of the circumstances and kind of took them back to rational reality, they couldn't believe who they'd become. Can you comment on some of those things?
So there is a YouTube channel called Academy of Ideas, and he has great content. It's really good, but he has some videos on this, how to come out of mass delusions and so on. From my having a look into it, I have 3 kind of pillars that I say one should follow. Although I should say, first of all, I think there's a philosophical thing here of, how do we make people realize this? I think maybe that's part of the problem, because that's, the other side's perspective as well, is how do we make people do this? Whereas I think really people need to take responsibility for themselves and they need to come to that journey themselves rather than being nudged into it.
Yes.
I think it was Carl Jung, but he said the crowd loses its mind all at once, and it only recovers its senses like slowly and one by one. So I don't think there's any kind of easy way out of this. But as I said, I have 3 kind of pillars. One is uncover, which is about learning these biases, learning these nudges. Once you can recognize them and spot them in the wild, so you're slightly less likely to be influenced by them, and you can learn kind of tactics of how to not be influenced by them. So, for example, we're less likely to fall prey to conformity if we're by ourselves when we make a decision. So, that's one thing. If you're worried about being nudged by what everyone else is doing, we'll make that decision in private. So that's one thing, is learning and kind of training, education. The second thing I call unplug. So you have to get away from these messaging. Even if you can recognize it for what it is, you're still influenced by it. So, for example, if you were a teenage boy like myself back in the 90s or the noughties, and you see a Lynx advert, and he sprays the spray and he gets chased by all these sexy women, obviously consciously, rationally, that's not true, but it's still subconsciously having the impact. And in the same way, you might know that there's a certain nudge in messaging, but you still, one way or another, be influenced by it as long as you're consuming it. So me, for example, I know that Apple use social proof and scarcity. Every time they release a new device, they don't make enough units to meet demand. So that makes it seem more attractive that it's scarce. And then they show people queuing up outside the store to buy it, and that uses social proof. So I know they use these tactics, but guess what? I still have an iPhone. I still want one. So really just try and withdraw from this stuff as much as possible. Now, obviously you want to, I'm not saying don't consume the news. You want to be well read and well informed, but it's better to use less persuasive media. So try and kind of read the news rather than watching it on TV, for example. They really start with this. The music they start the news with is like in the brainwashing books, they talk about how they use drums in brainwashing because it breaks down your conscious resistance. So the news literally has this music at the start to try and it's kind of religious music to try and get you in a hypnotic state of mind. Wow. So that's one thing, is unplug, and then the third thing is uplift. So basically try and be as conscious and rational as possible. So eat healthily, exercise, meditate, try and reduce decision fatigue. So Steve Jobs, for example, always used to wear the same outfit every day because that was one less decision he had to make. Yeah. I'm not saying go that far, but if you are, for example, reading the news, try not to do it when you're tired or hungry or stressed, because you'll be more susceptible to influence.
Well, so I want to touch on that in the last sense, because I want to look at how this piece links to how conspiracy theories can emerge, because there is clear points where there is misrepresentation of information that we've seen through the government's evidence. We've seen evidence being withheld. We've seen suppression of science. We've seen all of these things, and there's real issues in plain sight. But they are, for whatever reason, censored or smeared. But they're real, tangible issues. But I think I forget who talked about it now. But they talked about conspirituality, whereby people lose their sense. They start to question things so intensely, but they perhaps are not. They're not perhaps in their optimal state of mind, that uplifted state of mind. And I put it in terms of, like, you go through the floorboards, you lose the, you're exploring, you're digging and digging and digging, but then you go through the floor. That rational grounding is lost, so that you start to see connections between things that don't connect. Now, we've talked about conspiracy theories on this podcast, how to make the distinction. Do you have any thoughts around how to retain that conscious awareness, to have that open, connected mind, but avoid going through the floorboards? Because you become the conditions that you're put under this psychology of fear surely make you vulnerable to those things as well.
It's so tricky, because conspiracy theorist has been kind of abused really as a term. It's become a thought.
Totally, agreed. Yeah, absolutely.
But at the same time, there are things which are probably or demonstrably not true and are poisoning the well, as it were. So it is important to be able to distinguish. But then the question is, how do you do that? I don't know. That's something I've been wrestling with. I've even been buying, as I say, a book on Socrates, so I can understand the Socratic method. Because if you can't rely on, or you can't rely as much on established institutions and scientists and the news like we used to be able to, then it's very hard to know what's true. And we need things like the authority bias because it's how society functions. So like I was saying, the Earth being flat, how do we know it's not? Well, the vast majority of us, because someone in a lab coat told us so, and they're almost certainly right, but we used to be able to trust that, and now maybe we can't. And actually in Dante's Inferno, the lowest circle of hell is for people who are leaders who have exploited that trust, I think, because it's so crucial. So what to do about it, I'm not sure, but I think this is partly why I think we're going to see quite a resurgence in religion, because religions are codified collective knowledge, and it's not perfect by any means, but it's these lessons and facts and pieces of knowledge which have stood the test of time and give you kind of rules to live by. And as everything else becomes chaotic and uncertain, I think religion will give people something more stable to hold on to.
I certainly think there'll be a rise in spirituality. I think there's that may find itself personified through religion as well. But my perspective on the conspiracy theory piece is, I think it's the same principles can be used deliberately or unconsciously. I've seen the use of, I don't know what the term is, but you lose relatable fact followed by a relatable fact followed by some evidence, but then you use kind of logical fallacies to take people on a journey where it's more speculative. It's speculating on intent or drawing correlations with things that don't necessarily correlate. But because they've led with this relatable story backed with some evidence, that it creates I don't know if you can comment on the conditions here, but it then creates a condition where you believe what follows because the first part was accurate.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like the foot in the door thing. So there's a sales technique where you ask people 3 questions. You ask them 2 yes questions and then the target one that you want them to say yes to. So it sounds a bit like that. You say something credible, and then you've kind of got them sucked in for the next thing.
Yes, it's very difficult. Yeah, so I think this is all the same techniques are there. So it leaves us in this situation where essentially, I think the 3 things that you shared, uncover, that I love that, so you can spot these techniques as they're happening on either side of the debate, unplug, to restore your sense of sanity, and then uplift. I think it's important. I think where I see people starting to get into a state where they've become so disenfranchised, they become disempowered. That's where I think they become vulnerable to either fear from the government or fear from some distant threat in some other form.
Well, there's a great book on brainwashing called Battle for the Mind, and actually the best part is about the last 5 pages where it talks about how to not succumb to these techniques. And one of the things he says is that anger is just as useful for this as fear and guilt are. And actually, if you're kind of raging against this machine, that can actually be counterproductive because you're tiring yourself out and you're becoming emotional. And he likens it to a bull chasing the red flag all the time. And in the end, it gets so tired that it can easily be killed. So, yeah, I agree with you that the main thing is try and keep calm and keep detached as much as possible.
And we're right on time now, but I just want to close on one final story. I should have opened with it really because it's really recent, but we've got this situation with the latest variants. It's another story that it's an injection of fear. We talked about it offline, where you have, this desire for freedom, you have desire to travel again, desire to return to quote unquote normality. Yet we have this other fear messaging, which is putting doubt in the backs of people's mind. What was the principle that you described? How did you describe that principle earlier on?
The heaven and hell. So in these kind of brainwashing and in cults and things, they will preach about hellfire and so on. And again, that breaks you down, it gets you emotional and scared, but it's also a motivator. It puts that steam in the engine. And then the next thing they need to do is to point you in a certain direction and use that motivation. And that's where they talk about heaven. And if you do the right things and if you do these behaviors, then you can get to the good side. You can have the reward. So it's just cheese and electric shocks, basically. So they always, carrot and stick. So they have the carrot of opening up, but only so long as you do what they want. And so now you can see this energy, this steam is being directed towards the unvaccinated, saying if the unvaccinated don't get vaccinated, then the Indian variant might be a problem and we might have to lock down again.
Yep, and what we saw at the weekend was queues. It's like my old business mentor used to call it like children frothing at the mouth outside the sweet store. That was his way of describing a great marketing campaign. It's just like mindlessly trying to make your way into the candy store to like tear down the walls to get to your favorite sweets. We saw the same mentality. It's like boom, boom, overnight. If every business could learn how to get customers like that, but like the ethics behind it, again, it's just like, but these techniques work. It's fascinating. It's a real life, absolutely uncover your principle number one. You can witness it happen. You can see it firsthand. I mean, this morning I put a post up on Twitter saying, this argument about the unvaccinated being the threat to returning to normality. And I said, I've explored it from all angles, from a rational point of view. I just can't, looked at all the elements. Can someone educate me why that would prevent us from reopening other than the psychology of fear? And no one's come up with an answer. So if you have an answer on that, send it to me on a postcard or tweet me back. Patrick, I want to thank you so much for your time here on this podcast in this episode where we've looked at some fascinating principles, behavioral science principles. I want to direct you to a couple of resources. Patrick's website, patrickfagan.co.uk. We can find out more about his work. You'll also find out about his book, Hooked, where he's written about some of these principles in a business context. So for the entrepreneurs and business-minded and marketers amongst you, please check that out. It's endorsed by Rory Sutherland, who is the vice chair of Ogilvy, fascinating company. I prior to this episode, read a really fascinating article penned by yourself in The Critic. So I'm going to put the link to the article that Patrick wrote in the comments so you can see that as well. Any closing messages from you, Patrick, before we sign off for the day?
No, just try and keep a clear head, and I think that's it.
Stand guard at the door of your mind, in the words of is it Huxley that said that? I can't remember. But thank you again, Patrick. And for those at home watching this, thank you for sharing and engaging and participating in the comments. Please do share this episode if you haven't done so already. Some fascinating concepts within this discussion.